All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Dan Mead-Smith. I'm the president of the Washington Policy Center, and we appreciate you joining us today for a very informal legislative briefing. We appreciate you taking time. I know it's a busy week for you before session starts. And when we scheduled this, the House orientation was not scheduled. So all the House members, unfortunately, are in orientation as we understand it, but we're recording the session today. So if you have to leave early or you talk to your colleagues, we'll be sending it out to the 4 caucuses. So you'll be able to watch the session as your schedule allows over the next few days before the session starts on Monday. But congratulations on your election. We're excited to work with you as the session starts. We are, if you're not familiar with us or you didn't see our work during your campaigns, we're a public policy think tank based in Seattle. We just focus on Washington state policy issues. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy organization. We have 4 offices around Washington state, about a $4 million annual budget, and we have 8 research centers. That's how we organize ourselves. There's obviously lots of issues that we could cover as a policy think tank, but we focus on 8 areas of policy, and you'll be hearing from all of our research team that heads up each of those centers over the next 90 minutes or so. We're saving questions to the end so we can get in everybody in an hour and then spend about a half hour doing quick Q&A. But if there's something that you need answered, something to clarify something, it's obviously an informal group. So if you have something that you want to ask quickly, feel free to do that. Each of our center directors will spend 5 minutes talking about their policy area and what they see coming up during the legislative session and how we can be a resource to you. Unlike other groups that you'll be probably meeting with and hearing from, we do not lobby. We're a 501c3, as I said, nonprofit organization, so we're not registered lobbyists. We are a policy resource for all of you. We'll be analyzing bills throughout the session based on the 8 policy areas. And if you have either policy ideas for us during session or just simple research questions, a lot of our best ideas and projects come from legislators. So feel free to email our team. We'll put our emails in the follow-up email when we send out the recording, but feel free to email any of us during the session if you have questions on any policy area or you think something needs to be looked into more in depth. We'll be producing publications all throughout the legislative session. So with that, I'm gonna turn over to Paul Guppy. Paul is our Vice President for Research who oversees our research departments and team, and he'll tell you more about the products that we can offer you and the resources we can provide during session. But again, congratulations on being part of this historic session that will be remote, and we look forward to working with you throughout the legislative session and afterwards too. So thank you very much. Paul.
Great, thanks, Dan. Yeah, picking up on what Dan described about our general mission, what I'll do is focus on what the research department does and how our policy experts can be a resource to lawmakers, also in communicating ideas to the media and to our members who are across the state. So starting with the basics, again, as Dan mentioned, we're not a lobby organization. We're not a partisan organization. We focus on policy research, and we're very much supportive and promote the idea of civic engagement with the public for people who want to know what their government is up to on their behalf, what ideas can improve lives across the state. And particularly in the controversial times like these, where there's a lot of concern about what the government is doing, both at the state and national level, we are aware, and I'm sure you are as well, that there is a lot of distrust, a lot of concern, a lot of fake information that's around. And what we're trying to do is to cut through all of that by being strictly evidence-based. As you'll hear from our experts today, we are focused on research and facts and also presenting practical ideas that can really improve the lives for families, business owners, and communities across our state. And the number one product that we produce that provides that information is our policy guide for Washington state. So this is now in the 5th edition. It's updated. It contains 10 chapters on different policy areas that we cover. And again, each of our experts has contributed to those chapters. It's available online on our website. and also in print format, which for lawmakers like yourselves, we provide for free. We also provide it to our members across the state as they request it. And what the policy guide is, it's about 120 pages or so, and it is a compendium, a collection of all of our policy ideas in different areas. It is written in plain English, very accessible to the average person. It has a brief format in each section, and then 2 or 3 specific policy recommendations in different areas, how to improve the business climate or tax policies or promote jobs, better education, healthcare, protecting the environment, all the issues that we cover. But the bottom line about the policy guide is that it's readable and accessible, and also practical in that it provides positive ideas about what our state government can do to improve lives for people across the state. The other thing that our staff provides as a resource, and you'll be hearing from them in a few minutes, is answering any question on different research issues. One thing I should emphasize is that communication with our staff is strictly professional and confidential. So although we work a lot with the media, we do a lot of writing for our blog, we do social media, we're in contact with our members across the state. When it comes to individual questions or conversations that we have with public officials, those are always done confidentially unless the public official wants us to promote an issue or a bill that they have. So we're available for that resource. Another resource we have is our experts are available for testifying before committees, for appearing at public events to talk about bills or legislation. This upcoming legislative session is going to be different. It's going to be online. Our experts are available to provide remote testimony when there are work sessions and committee hearings in different issue areas that you're working on. And then finally, I'll mention as a resource, we have with us Franz Gregory, who's the director of our WashingtonVotes.org website. And this is a free website that's available to the general public that provides a description and access to every bill that's introduced, every amendment. It reports on every roll call vote. And this is all done on a neutral, nonpartisan basis. So when citizens want to find out how to contact their legislator, what committee is dealing with bills that are important to them, WashingtonVotes.org provides that resource, and Franz will be giving more description about that. And then the last area that I'll touch on that our staff does is actively tracking issues every day during the legislative session, and then reporting that to the media and our members and our blog on social media to folks across the state. So we have a lot of interest from people who want to know what their state government is up to. We provide a convenient conduit and resource for the way people can learn about what's going on. So for individual members of the legislature, if there are issues that you're interested in or important bills that you're introducing, you can familiarize us with that. And we are happy to then describe or analyze and report that to the general public and help kind of spread the word about what we consider are good ideas, or even when the legislature is considering bad ideas, we talk about those as well. So with that, let's get right on to our experts. So I'll turn it over to David Bose, our communications director, and he'll introduce each member of our staff, who will then give a short presentation of the issues that they're working on. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, thanks, Paul. This is going to be a pretty basic format. I'll basically just be a facilitator. I'll disappear. You'll just hear me to facilitate moving from one center director to the next. If you have a question at any point, even if you already have a question for any center director, you should put it in the chat function. We'll have a Q&A at the end, but it's nice to gather all those up. And then also, if you have a desire to be anonymous, this is, after all, this is a bipartisan event. We'll be providing recordings to both sides of the legislative aisle. So if there's a question you want to make anonymously, you should send that to me direct in the chat, or you can email it to me at dbose@washingtonpolicy.org. And so this, again, this is being recorded, and the recordings will be provided to both sides of the legislative aisle. The first up for from our Center for Transportation, our Cole Center for Transportation, is Maria Frost to give her presentation.
Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon, everybody. So the Cole Center for Transportation researches and analyzes best practices for relieving traffic congestion with a specific focus on highway and transit projects and how public tax dollars are spent. Our free market principles inform how we analyze policy. So at the Cool Center, those transportation principles are fivefold. Tie spending to performance measures like congestion relief, respect people's freedom of mobility, deploy resources based on voluntary market demand, improve freight mobility, and encourage the use of public-private partnerships. As we head into the 2021 legislative session, the principles that of those five that immediately come to mind as I think of the issues that may be up for discussion are the principle of tying spending to performance measures and responding to market demand. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So regarding tying spending to performance measures, our state used to have performance measures in place a little over a decade ago that included keeping traffic delays below the national average. So accommodating trips through a reduction in congestion. That was replaced with policy that directs the state to instead manage traffic congestion and reduce how much people drive as a way to reduce carbon emissions. As a result, DOT now focuses more on reducing vehicle miles traveled by drivers rather than tracking and trying to reduce the amount of time that people spend sitting in traffic. So we would, of course, like to see traffic congestion metrics be reinstated and for the Washington State Department of Transportation to get away from managing travel behavior. Instead, there may be an effort this session to dilute metrics even more by making changes to the state transportation policy goals, which currently include safety, mobility, preservation, environment, stewardship, and economic vitality, but to change those and include new goals like public health, equity, environmental justice. I think these are important issues that are worth talking about, but do not need to be undertaken as key goals of a state transportation agency that the public is paying to deliver transportation infrastructure that is safe, reliable, and cost-effective. Another issue that could come up that's closely tied to performance metrics, and actually kind of the previous subject that I just mentioned, is an effort to create a performance-based evaluation system for the project list that lawmakers create and negotiate funding for their districts. So the Washington State Department of Transportation would like to create a scoring and screening tool that basically ranks those projects according to whether they meet transportation policy goals mentioned earlier and how they meet environmental and health and equity goals of the agency. So the projects would go through these various evaluations conducted by Department of Transportation staff. They would receive composite scores and would be added back to the project list in a ranked order based on that score. And that process would give the Department of Transportation more power over lawmakers' funding decisions by giving what equates to a policy and a moral ranking of each project. And so that would likely elevate transit, bike, pedestrian projects above other projects for which there is a stronger demand. So as you recall, one of our key principles is to respond to voluntary market demand rather than trying to engineer demand by spending public money where it might not make sense to do so. So the way the evaluation model is currently structured, the outcome would be precisely the opposite. So that issue is very likely to come up this session. I think performance-based evaluation of transportation projects is not a terrible idea, but I'm concerned that the Department of Transportation is infusing what could be this useful tool for lawmakers with ideology rather than objective metrics. And lastly, I just want to put on your radar the effort to replace the state gas tax with a road usage charge or a per mile charge. So rather than paying for every gallon of gas at the pump, you pay for every mile that you drive. There may be legislation this session, as there was last session, to implement a road usage charge, starting with a smaller fleet of electric vehicles. And though you could make a case that electric vehicles are a reasonable place to start, we believe that it is both unnecessary and far too soon to implement this policy, especially when there's a divisive debate brewing over how the money should be spent. Should it be spent on roads like the gas tax, or should it be spent on transit, a much less used mode, which would turn this into a general mileage tax? So I'm happy to be a resource to you on any of these issues. We do have a 5 Principles of Responsible Transportation Policy document that we'll be updating later this year, but we have that available if you're interested. We have detailed memos from last session on legislation seeking to change transportation policy goals. They're likely to be revised, they're likely to come up again and with similar language. And then there's a number of publications and research that we have written on the road usage charge and our personal experience with the pilot project itself. So please reach out if you want to dig deeper on any of these issues. I'm happy to be a resource to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Maria. Next up, we have Todd Myers, our Center for the Environment Director. Todd?
Good afternoon. So I am the director for on the environmental side. I've been working in environmental policy for about 20 years. Started at the State Department of Natural Resources, currently sit on the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council. And one of the common themes that you'll hear from me is that the things that we do at Washington State with regards to the environment are more about image and sort of rewarding special interest groups than helping the environment. And you see this in a variety of different areas. We just finished the 2020 goals for a couple of things. One, for Puget Sound recovery and salmon recovery. We are nowhere close to meeting our goals as part of the Puget Sound partnership goals that they set up. The other goal was a 2020 target for CO2 emissions reductions. We won't have that data for a couple of years, but I can tell you right now that we are nowhere close to meeting it. And the reason that we keep failing to meet these is that rather than emphasizing bang for the buck, how effective our policies are, we focus on sort of feel-good policies that are supported by various different special interest groups. And so let me just give you a quick overview of a couple of examples. The first is that we're going to look at subsidizing rooftop solar. So it's called community solar. The governor wanted about $50 million for it last year, but ended up vetoing it because of the concerns about the COVID crisis. That is going to come back. If you want to reduce CO2 emissions, rooftop solar is the absolute worst way to do it. So this graph is from a group called Lazard. The Energy Information Administration puts out a similar thing where they compare all the various different types of energy in terms of cost per CO2, how much it costs for energy and reducing CO2. And what you can see right there at the very top is that rooftop residential solar is far and away the most expensive form of energy. So if you're trying to find forms of energy that reduce CO2 emissions, rooftop solar is the absolute worst. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory does a similar thing where they rank different parts of the country for different types of energy. And Western Washington is literally the worst place in the entire country for rooftop solar. So despite that though, we subsidize solar in Washington State, not because it works, but because it sounds good. And so again and again, you're gonna find that that is the sort of approach. You don't have to believe that climate change is a crisis. Or if you do believe that climate change is a crisis, you want to get the most bang for your buck in terms of taxpayer dollars. That's good for taxpayers, it's good for the environment. Another one of those issues that you're going to deal with this year is what's called the low carbon fuel standard. Transportation is the #1 source of CO2 emissions in Washington State. And so there's going to be an effort to focus on ways to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels in Washington State. California and Oregon have already done this. And what we find is that, again, it is a remarkably inefficient and ineffective way to reduce CO2. I can find projects that reduce CO2 emissions for $10 a metric ton. Currently in California, it costs $200 per metric ton, 20 times as much. as projects are available on the open market, which means that we're basically wasting 95% of every dollar we spend on the low carbon fuel standard, while we're increasing gas prices about 20 cents a gallon. So again, you can argue that we need to take steps on climate change and reducing CO2 emissions. Rooftop solar and low carbon fuel standard are two of the absolute worst ways to do that, and yet those are the ways that we are focusing on. So that's the focus, that's sort of the approach that we take to looking at policies in this upcoming session and whether they are effective. I'll just finish with this, is that we look at a technology-based approach where we empower people to do more with less. The market is really good at that. And I love this quote from Bill Ruckelshaus. He says, yesterday's solutions worked well on yesterday's problems, but the solutions we devised back in the 1970s aren't likely to make much of a dent into environmental problems we face today. Technology is going to do better than big government for the problems that we have that are more distributed. So with that, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. These are the issues that I tend to work on. So if you have questions on those or any other environmental issues, please let me know. I'm happy to answer anything.
Thanks, Todd. And that's a good reminder. At any point in time, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can chat it directly to me if you want that question to be anonymous. You can also, if you don't trust Zoom, you can email me, dbose@washingtonpolicy.org, and I can keep that question anonymous as well for the closing Q&A portion. And we'll open it up to you. You'll be able to speak directly at the end. So next up, we have Jason Mercier, our director for our Center for Government Reform. Jason?
Great, thank you, Dave, and greetings from the Tri-Cities. So I've got 3 issues on my priority list this session that are going to be on the top of your list as well. And that is the budget, income taxes, and emergency powers reform. Now, on the budget, you're going to hear a lot of talk about learning the lessons from the Great Recession and avoiding an austerity budget. That may have been warranted back in the spring, but after the November revenue forecast, that type of framing is entirely misplaced. We are currently in this budget, which it represents almost a 20% increase in spending over the prior budget, balanced with just under 11% revenue growth. That revenue growth is projected to continue to grow by an additional 7% going into the 21-23 budget. So you've got a balanced budget, you've got revenue growth. This is not the Great Recession. Whatever you do is not going to be an austerity budget. And we're hearing discussion about an income tax, throwing away what the Department of Commerce calls our competitive advantage of no income taxes. We know an income tax is on the table because I personally contacted the revenue director of every single state across the country and asked them, is a capital gains tax an excise tax or an income tax? Every one of those revenue directors without fail said it is an income tax. And frankly, several of them laughed at me, thinking the question was so ridiculous, not understanding that capital gains are income. We also know from a letter from the IRS talking about the proposals in Washington state, they were asked point blank, is a capital gains tax an excise tax or an income tax? And the IRS, in no uncertain terms, says it is an income tax. Capital gains are income. That's how they are taxed. Now, why are we even having this debate in the state of Washington? Because for almost 100 years, the state Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that you own your income. And if you own your income under Washington's Constitution, it is property, which means it can't be taxed at more than 1% of its value, and it has to be taxed uniformly. That's why you can't have a graduated income tax. The voters have rejected 6 constitutional amendments. So that's why this game is being played, to see if they can circumvent those restrictions and get the courts to allow this without the voters approving it. Whether or not it's legal, it's just bad policy. Again, we contacted every revenue director in the country, asked them, are capital gains dependable and stable or unpredictable and volatile? Every single state said incredibly unpredictable. You can't rely on them. And in fact, the Virginia economist, I just asked him a simple question. I couldn't get him off the phone. He vented for 20 minutes about how much capital gains wrecks his revenue projections. Aside from the income tax, you're going to be having a long conversation about emergency powers. You can agree 100% with every single decision the governor has made for the past 9 months and still be concerned about how this is being executed. Because underneath our constitutional form of government, the legislative branch makes policy, the executive branch implements it. Yet for 9 months, the legislative branch, the people's branch, has been totally cut out of all the governing decisions. That's not really the way it happens in most of the country. Whether you look at Minnesota, they require after 30 days of an emergency declaration, the legislature has to be brought back into the conversation. Wisconsin does it for 60 days. Whether it's 30 days, 60 days, or just requiring the four corners to sign off on something, the legislative branch of government has got to be put back in the driver's seat after an initial 30 days of emergency declaration. Again, you're going to be having these debates on the budget, taxes, and emergency powers. We're a resource for you. We just need an invite to testify. I'll turn it back to Dave.
Thank you, Jason. I see we have a couple of questions in the chat function, so continue. If you any questions pop up, make sure you put them in the chat just so we don't lose track as the program continues. Now I'd like to bring forward Dr. Roger Stark. Dr. Stark? Dr. Stark is, of course, he has been historically our healthcare policy analyst, and he's kind of merging into a new emeritus status. Dr. Stark, you ready to go?
Yeah, I am. I just had an internet interruption. Anyway, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending. I am a retired physician, as Dave said, but I've specifically dealt with healthcare policy for the last 12 years at Washington Policy Center. There are three issues I want to discuss this afternoon with you. The first has to do with an extension of the Inslee administration executive orders that were put forth over the last 8 to 9 months to deal with the pandemic. Specifically, what we would like to see is a repeal of certificate of need laws. We would like to see a relaxation of provider licensing, and we would like to see meaningful tort reform. Those are all things that, again, were provided via executive order. We would like to see those put into legislative action. Let me also say that from a free market standpoint, as it deals with healthcare, what it means is putting the patient in charge rather than employers or rather than government. We would like to see patients making their own healthcare decisions and using their own healthcare dollars. The second issue I want to discuss with you is the single payer committee that was placed in the budget in the 2020 legislative session. Both the House and the Senate had bills. Geez, I'm terribly sorry about this. It seemed to work before. What I was saying was that from a free market standpoint, the patient is really more important than employers or than the government. And what we would like to see is the patient be in charge of their healthcare decisions and their healthcare dollars. The second issue I wanted to discuss with you was the single payer committee that was placed in the budget in the 2020 legislative session. This committee is supposed to report back to the legislature this session 2021. In looking at the meetings that they've held over the last 8 to 10 months, it's been very clear that they're not only dealing with who should be involved in the single payer system, but also the cost. Vermont passed legislation to set up a state single payer system. This was repealed. The Colorado voters turned it down because of cost. And arguably one of the most liberal legislatures in the country is in California, and they have not been able to pass a single payer system, again, simply because of cost. The third issue I want to discuss then was the public option. This was passed on the state basis by the 2019 legislature, and it is ostensibly supposed to start in 2021. Governor Inslee has deferred this. He realizes that there are some mechanical problems, there's some cost problems with the public option being placed in the Obamacare exchange in Washington state. There is no funding mechanism. I think the state officials hope that federal dollars will come into the state to support this public option. If not, Washington state taxpayers will be on the hook for arguably millions of dollars to fund this public option. So those are the three issues that we see and three issues that we'd like to put before you. Again, I'm a resource. If you have questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stark. Next up, we have Lee Finna. She is our Center Director for our Center for Education. Lee, welcome, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you all. Congratulations on your being elected to represent your district. Our Center for Education is focused very much like the healthcare center. We think that the people closest to children, that is the parents, the teachers, and the principals, should have control over the school funding so that the children can be best served, so that their needs are served best. So in the coming session, there's always a lot of misinformation about education. So I'm going to share a screen. Obviously, the biggest issue is about school reopening. Now, let me just see if I can find here my darn thing. Okay, never mind. I have to tell you, I found a data tracker of the schools reopening across the United States. It's called the Burbio Data Tracker. He is tracking since August where the schools are open to in-person instruction in the United States and where they're open to hybrid instruction and where they are closed and virtual instruction only. Washington State fits into the 1/3 of the students in the country that are only receiving remote virtual instruction. Another 25% of the students in the country are receiving hybrid education, which means they're getting 2 or 3 days of in-person instruction and the rest of instruction remote. And then there's the other third that are receiving full in-person instruction. Those are the states across the Sun Belt: Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Texas, and up through the upper Midwestern states. And so we have a third of the nation's students are receiving full in-person instruction, a third are receiving remote learning, and 25% are receiving hybrid. And as this Burbio tracker is reporting these changes every week, and I will attempt to inform the legislature how these numbers change, but we are predicting that Washington State will not open schools to high school students at all this year. This Burbio tracker has already noticed that the governor has loosened the requirements, hoping to open schools to in-person instruction in the lower grades, but that high school students in Washington State cannot hope to see their schools open this spring. So that is an important fact, because one of the issues of the legislature, since over 50% of the budget is spent on the schools, is more money for the schools. What's happened is about 40 to 50,000 students have dropped out of the public schools, representing about $500 to $600 million in funding that their school districts are no longer getting from the state. And the special interests are hoping to grab that money for the schools and not give it to the parents who've been burdened with extra costs for daycare and tutoring and keeping their kids on track if they can during this pandemic school shutdown. So we're hoping to see a bill that would give that funding directly to parents so that they can hire a tutor to educate their children. You understand that the public school system is like a train. It's on a track, it moves, there's a schedule, and the children will be left behind. And now we're seeing studies from groups like McKinsey showing that low-income minority children are going to be up to a year behind in their learning. They're going to lose up to average children, K-12 students are going to lose between $60,000 to $80,000 a year in, not a year, but in their income over the course of their lives. This is a serious matter that is going to hurt children for a generation. And to see the schools remain closed in heavily bureaucratic unionized states like Washington is heartbreaking to those who care about education. So the other bill that we're hoping to see is the bill Representative Vicky Kraft out of Vancouver has proposed last session to give parents $12,000 in scholarships so they can send their children to a school that is open. And that bill I understand is going to be reintroduced this session. And so that's what we'll be following. I'm very knowledgeable about the amount of money that is going to each school and can easily obtain that for your district. If you have any questions, I'm available by email, and we'll be happy to help you in your work ahead. So thank you very much for attending today.
Okay, thank you, Lieve. Next up, and again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I notice some people are going back and forth in the chat, which is going to leave us fewer questions to answer at the end, but that's okay. Next up is our Center for Small Business Director, Mark Harmsworth.
Thanks, Dave. And congratulations, senators and representatives. I've been in your shoes, as you may know. I feel your pain, as you've heard one politician once say once. But I want to cover three things today in small business. I also want to just reiterate WA Votes, the policy guide, and the testimony that the Washington Policy Center offers, testimony option that we offer, is invaluable to a legislator. And I definitely took advantage of that when I was serving in Olympia, and very beneficial. If you're feeling like you are drinking from a fire hose, you can read one of those policy guides and at least sound somewhat intelligent on some of these issues. I know you guys your IQs are off the charts, but I don't know. When I served, I knew I didn't know everything. So I had to try and figure it out. So three things, because when I'm told, I need to tell you these things up front. The Employment Security Department, you got to take a look at that this year. It's in a mess. The L&I overreach that we've seen this year during COVID, take a good look at that. And I'm going to drill into these, obviously. And then some licensing simplification ideas that we have as a group. So at the top there, ESD reform. The current proposal is an increase of anywhere between 500 and 700% on unemployment taxes. Obviously, the department has struggled with that. The state, as Jason mentioned earlier, is seeing anywhere up to a 5% projected increase in the governor's budget this year. So there's absolutely no need for the ESD to go back to employers and increase their rates. Some employers are going to lay people off because of those rate increases. So if you've not seen that yet, take a quick look at it. This is to recover the $4 to $5 billion that have been drained from the fund because of the unemployment benefits. And just to add cherry to that cake, the governor is also suggesting that we increase the minimum to 20% on unemployment benefits. So you need to get your calculators out, figure out what's fair for folks that are unemployed, figure out how to reimburse that fund, but we can't put that burden on the employers. A solution for that could be private accounts, similar to 401ks, where you could have a private unemployment account. And on our site, and I've put out many papers on this, describing what that would look like. And then top of all, an ESD, it needs an audit, maybe a JLARC review or something that needs to go through that department. I know the auditor's looking through it right now and they're having some resistance, but I think we need something more in depth and some significant reform there. Labor and industries, overreach this year, having businesses enforce edicts, unconstitutional edicts in some cases. That needs to be curtailed. And then the lockdowns, we've just put a study out on lockdowns across states, and you'll see that for the states that have completely opened up, their infection rates for COVID are declining faster now than the states that remain locked down. All that data, and we did a very data-driven approach, is available on our site, and there's a study out there. I did 5 states: California, Washington, South Dakota, Kansas, and one other that's slipping my mind right now. But we took a look at all that data, and you can see yourself exactly what the effects of the lockdowns are. They don't work. So take a look at that. And then rates, hold the line on L&I rates. It will be something we'll be pushing this year because a lot of these employers, your employees at home, so how are they getting injured? Right now, they're proposing no rate increases, but there is a paper that just came out that suggests that they're depleting their fund quickly. And then the third thing is licensing simplification. I call this the lemonade stand legislation. And what that is we've seen a dramatic change in the way that we're working this year with COVID and licensing. And I'm a small business owner. I have licenses in 8 or 9 different cities, and I pay $50 a year for absolutely no benefit to each of those cities, other than the fact I have to now file tax returns and fill in all these extra paperwork. That has to be simpler. We took a step 2 years ago to try and centralize it. I was part of that. But now I think what we need is one license that, depending on your business, will let you work across the state, and the state needs to figure out how to do that. So that may be something you want to bite off as you're looking at legislation. Again, those 3 things: ESD reform, L&I overreach and reform, and then licensing simplification. The 3 issues I think will be big this year, along with all the usual stuff around occupational licensing and small business reform. If you need anything, my email, I'm sure that'll pop up here at some point. Give us a call and I'm happy to help. And if you need a shoulder to cry on when things get too tough, call Dave Bose.
Well, thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
And that's a reminder too, that each center director has their email and contact information at the WashingtonPolicy.org website. They make themselves very available and very easy to contact. So if you do have any further questions or questions you don't feel comfortable asking here, they are always a resource to you. Next up, we have our initiative, a WPC initiative on agriculture director, Pam Lewison. Pam.
Thank you, Dave, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Pam Lewison, and as Dave mentioned, I run ag research for the Washington Policy Center. And in addition to that, just in case you're curious about my expertise, I also happen to run a farm in the Moses Lake area. I think there are two really big issues that are likely to visit ag this session. The first is ag labor, and the other is taxes. So I'll delve into the labor a little bit more. It's a multi-layered question and problem. The first part of that will be temporary worker housing regulations. Washington State relies very heavily on temporary workers through the H-2A program. And as the restrictions for COVID continue, housing becomes very challenging for growers, particularly in their limits of the number of people who can be in a cohort. The current number is 15. That's an arbitrary number that was just pulled out of somebody's hat. It can be any number in a cohort. And I would recommend a significant increase in the number of people in a cohort. The other part of those housing regulations that's troublesome is bunk beds. So if you were listening at all during the last growing season, they tried to take bunk beds out of temporary worker housing, which would essentially cut the number of workers we could have in half, and workers who were promised somewhere to live would essentially be homeless. So bunk beds are incredibly important to our temporary workers because it gives them a place to live and a place to rest after a long day of work. And any comparison between Washington and Oregon related to temporary worker housing and bunk beds in particular is an apples and oranges comparison. We hire approximately 25,000 temporary workers in Washington State. Oregon hires about 1,500. So they're two very different problems with very different solutions. In addition to housing issues, H-2A administration is done in part through employment security. Employment security is going to continue to seek to increase funding on a state level. The H-2A program is a federal program. It is generally administered through grant funding from the federal side of things and then funneled through state agencies. ESD asked for some sort of increase to help cover their administrative costs, yet they cannot tell anyone why they need those additional fees. And that includes the panel that was convened after the last legislative session to discuss that fee increase. And I think the more important part of that to remember is that the farm community is under a great deal of pressure and in the current environment. And H-2A is already an extraordinarily expensive program to participate in. It is cost prohibitive on purpose already. And it costs approximately $1,500 per worker per application. That does not include the costs of paying that person to work for you, their travel to and from their home countries, or any of your housing or transportation costs while they're in the country as your employee. So any additional cost to H-2A becomes an even more extraordinary burden on farmers. The last part of the labor discussion that is going to be critical moving into the legislative session is the ending of the overtime exemption for dairy farmers. This is going to represent a significant cost increase for operations in dairies in particular. They are generally on a 12-hour shift cycle. It's going to represent a change from a 12-hour cycle to perhaps an 8-hour shift cycle, with additional workers having to be hired, or a reduction in pay for employees so that their employers can continue to pay them once they reach that overtime limit. It gets a little bit muddy about how to do that and what the best way to do it is. The fear in the ag community is one that we're putting longtime workers at risk when they don't need to be, because we're not able to afford overtime pay. And more specifically, if there's an expansion of the ending of the overtime exemption to the rest of the ag sector, there's a significant money problem that goes along with that. So that's the short version of the ag labor questions. And then the other topic of discussion is taxes. As Jason and Todd, I think, have both mentioned, there's always sort of lots of conversation around budgets and how to plug holes. And oftentimes ag gets identified as low-hanging fruit where more taxes can be paid. Something to consider about that is that farms are essentially wholesale manufacturers who are not able to name the cost for their product. Someone else dictates how much they get paid for what they manufacture. And I did a study last year at the beginning of the legislative session that estimated on a conservative level, the ag community on the whole pays approximately $1 billion in annual taxes already. So any exemptions that are extended to the ag community are exemptions that are not different than what you would see in building or software or anywhere else across the business community. And to pigeonhole ag in particular as needing to pay more while no one else does, it makes a challenging budget cycle for the ag community even more difficult. So again, ag labor, ag taxes, and anything else that happens to fall under the ag's purview comes into my wheelhouse. So I'm a resource and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Pam. Next up, we have Franz Gregory. He heads up our Washington Votes efforts, and he'll describe what kinds of services Washington Votes provides for people who track the legislature. Franz?
Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon, everyone. And once again, let me add my congratulations to the newly elected members of the upcoming 117th legislature. As Dave mentioned, I direct WashingtonVotes.org. I'm a former chief clerk of the House and also a former director of the House Nonpartisan Committee Staff Resources. The site is sponsored by Washington Policy Center, and we've been operating as a comprehensive, public, free, nonpartisan legislative tracking tool since the 2001 session. So it's a long time. It provides a searchable database of current bills, resolutions, and amendments before the legislature and the recorded floor votes taken by legislators. This information is organized by individual legislator along with a listing of the bills and amendments such members have sponsored. It's also searchable all the way back to 2001. The information is updated daily according to legislative actions, and users can subscribe to a daily email update on legislation by categories that they select. Now, here are some numbers to give you an idea of our site's reach. We have nearly 7,000 regular subscribers and 173 reporter contacts from daily and weekly newspapers across the state. In the comparable session of 2019, which like this year was a budget writing year, we had some 58,000 users, visitors, and 225,000 page views, according to Google Analytics. In terms of information volume, the 2019 105-day session saw 2,300 bills introduced, with 485 measures passed and 1,428 recorded floor votes taken. With respect to media subscribers, we send out a weekly roll call report covering key legislation voted on. The roll call is key to districts and legislators that each of these media cover and is typically published by the media under heading something like how your legislators voted in Olympia this week. At the end of the session, we also publish a missed votes report that shows the number of votes taken and missed by legislators during the session. And as you might imagine, it's a very popular feature with the media. But we know that there could be many reasons why a legislator might have missed a vote or two or more during the session. And so we give members an opportunity to comment on their missed votes, and we publish those comments along with the report. Finally, we publish a twice weekly newsletter with additional in-depth information and insights on evolving legislative issues and action. It's featured on our homepage and distributed by email to our subscribers. So check out the site at washingtonvotes.org. And if you like, sign up as a subscriber to receive all the information we send out. Thanks and all the best to you this session.
Thank you, Franz. Appreciate it. There is Washington Votes, as he mentions, when we deliver the roll call report, it's done on a very nonpartisan basis. Franz does a great job outlining why people have missed votes for a missed votes report, and gives a lot of context to that, which might be missing from other coverage, particularly in the social media era. So it's a really great resource. And it does provide context, which is important for certain things. With that, we now move into our Q&A session. If anyone has any specific questions that you'd like to bring up, we'd love to hear from you. Some of you have been asking questions and getting them answered in the chat function, which is great because we've moved ourselves along in that fashion. Are there any questions, though, for any particular staff?
Took me a second to unmute. Hey, I got a question for Todd. You mentioned that there's other more cost-effective measures, and I know that one of the things you talked about was like the electronic thermostats and stuff like that. Do you have some examples of some of the other items that are more cost-effective?
Sure. So one of the easiest is what's called methane capture. So methane capture from landfills, actually a number of the landfills in the area already do something like this, which is that when the trash decomposes, it creates methane. The methane is captured and then used actually to run part of the operations of the landfill. That's not true everywhere though. And since methane is a particularly potent greenhouse gas, capturing 1 metric ton of methane really gets you a long way. There is a market for these types of projects, and the current market price really ranges anywhere from about $3 a metric ton to about $10 a metric ton. And rather than sort of pick and choose or look at what the projects are, what I would suggest the state do is simply say, and Seattle City Light has done this, we want to reduce CO2 emissions, you bid to us and tell us how you're going to do it. And then we'll invest in those projects. This is basically what the state already does, but the projects are not chosen based on effectiveness, they're chosen based on politics, which is why we choose a low carbon fuel standard and rooftop solar rather than methane capture and things like that. So I just wrote, so the governor was asked about my critique of his policy on TVW, and he said, well, I haven't heard any alternatives. And it would be irresponsible for people to criticize my ideas without alternatives. So I wrote him a letter and I sent it to him certified mail, which they tell me has been delivered based on the tracking. So he now has those ideas. But you can read that letter that I wrote to him at our blog at washingtonpolicy.org. And it talks a little bit about the types of projects that are out there. But the goal is to say, we want to create more of these types of projects. We want people to innovate new technologies so that we can do this more effectively. And the way to do this is to say, we have a fund, we have money for people who are willing to do this. We can reach all of the goals of the low carbon fuel standard by their goal is to reduce 2.7 million metric tons of CO2 by 2030. We could do that this year for half the price of the subsidy that is proposed for solar for the next biennium. We could do it this year. We don't have to wait. That's how powerful it is. It's not merely more economically responsible, it's more environmentally responsible.
Any further questions? Okay, for those of you listening, if you have questions that listening, because we'll share this recording later. If you have questions, feel free to email us at any time. The email of each center director is available at washingtonpolicy.org. You can look at the staff right up in the About section, and each of their contact information is available. It's also available at the bottom of each center page. So if you go to our website and just look at the scroll down menu of centers, you can go to the center of the topic of your choice and get the information there. I want to thank all the center directors for attending, the legislators, elected members. Thank you for attending Washington Policy Center's legislative briefing. We very much appreciate your time. And for those of you who are listening to this as a recording, we appreciate you listening as well. WPC would like to be a resource for you. If you have any questions about policy, any areas that you're wondering about, we appreciate you contacting us and asking. Again, if you need testimony, center directors can testify, but only at your request. So you'll have to request testimony if you're looking for testimony on a specific topic as well. And we also, our blog is updated daily, if not hourly. Center directors are very active during the legislative session, and there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of updates that take place at the blogs, and you get kind of a forward look at what our official publications will say on our blog site. So you can check out both those things and subscribe to our weekly newsletter to get regular updates as well. We'll also be hosting some regular Olympia Watch events where we'll be tracking what's happening in Olympia. We have a legislative lunchbox series where we encourage legislators to get involved and participate in our every other week virtual events. That's our Washington Policy on the Go legislative lunchbox series. So if you'd like to participate in that, we'd love to hear from you as well. Thank you so much for attending today, and we hope this information has been helpful to you. Thank you.